So this is going to be a different episode than my usual episodes, and it's one of two that were recorded live in various venues. So I'm really pleased about having had the opportunity to do this interview with David Miller, someone that I really admire, and he's somebody who had a lot of really incredible things to say and share, both personally and professionally. But, because of his availability, we needed to do it in a venue. So you might hear background noise, you might hear background music. I did my best to denoise it, but not always easy. But I think the content is really, really strong, and I think it's a really great interview. And next week, I'll have part two, and that's going to be with Adam Cawley, who's an incredible Toronto comedian and host of a really great podcast called the Backline Podcast. So it was a pleasure to speak with him as well. Once again in a bar, but I think it made for a really interesting interview. So I'll leave you with that, and I hope you enjoy the episode. You're listening to another episode of Faith Deficit, a weekly program that explores individual stories of faith in an increasingly secular world. So, my guest today is David Miller. David Miller was the president and CEO of WWF Canada, the Canadian division of the International World Wildlife Fund. He's a former politician. Miller was the 63rd mayor of Toronto from 2003 to 2010, and served as a Toronto Councillor before his role as mayor. He's now the North American director for C40 Cities. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. And so this is a recent change for you, right? Do you want to talk a little bit about C40 Cities?
Sure. C40 Cities is a group originally of 40, hence the name, but now 92 of the world's leading cities. And they come together for one purpose, which is to fight climate change. It's a mayor's organization. So, and the reason I value it and joined it is because mayors can be uniquely effective in dealing with climate change. It's because the role of a mayor in a city government is to do real things on the ground. That's what people expect them to do, so they can take real actions and do. Because that's their role. And the second thing is because it's the world's leading cities, so Jakarta, Tel Aviv, Toronto, Montreal, New York, Chicago, Paris, Sao Paulo, Cape Town, cities like that, it has a very, very significant impact on the international stage. Mm-hmm. So it's an organization that can make a very real difference on an issue that deeply matters to us today.
Is it an issue that deeply matters to you?
Yes.
I feel like you have had a real passion for environmental work for a long time. Even as a politician, it seems like something that you've always championed. And is that kind of what, when you finish your career as mayor, is that something that you gravitated towards?
Yeah, it's always, when I knew I wasn't going to run again in 2006 after I was reelected.
Yeah.
Because I had a conversation with my chief of staff right after the election, and I said, boy, I really didn't enjoy that campaign. And it was, to most people, it was the most successful possible campaign, because I got 60% of the vote.
Yeah.
I had a very clear agenda. I got a mandate not only to raise taxes, but to create entirely new ones in order to build a great city. That's what people wanted then. They said, we're willing to pay a little bit more if it's invested in the city of the future. And I said I didn't enjoy it, and I said to her, I don't know if I've got another one in me. It was my seventh election, I think, maybe more than that.
Yeah.
And she said, how old are your children going to be in 2010? And I thought about it, and I realized they were going to be in high school. And I'd literally never been home for dinner. They'd both been born after I was first elected. So I knew pretty much from that moment on I wouldn't run again. So I had a lot of time to think about what would I want to do post-politics. Now, I didn't spend much of my time in 2007, 8, or 9 thinking about that, but I really thought, where can I uniquely make a difference? And I really felt it was in the environmental space. So I immediately post-politics, I worked as a lawyer, but my role was on environmental initiatives. my title was something like Council International Business and Sustainability. We had a lot of clients who were in clean energy, for example. And then the move to the WWF, and then the move to the C40, an organization which I know well because I chaired it from 2008 to 2010. So it was a very conscious choice on my part, not just during my political career, but post-politics, to focus on environmental issues.
So, what if I can take it back for a moment, if you don't mind? One thing that was really interesting to me is that, so your mother was English and your father was from California,
yes.
I think, right? And that's the same for me. My mom was from England, and my dad was actually a draft dodger who came up from California to Vancouver, and he stayed with Quakers and then moved across, and he met my mom in Toronto. And I think I always had a fascination with these other places. I know that you had spent some time living, went to Harvard, so you were in Boston, you lived in San Francisco, and I think you were born in England, but moved really shortly.
Born in the States.
Born in the States, moved to
England. Yeah.
That's what it was, yeah. So, but for me, I always felt kind of a displacement from these other parts of the world where I had family. And then I'd meet folks again, and it would be like a weird kind of familiar recognition, but it's like I know that we kind of communicate in the same way, but obviously we're so different. So I'm wondering if you ever felt that kind of displacement growing up.
Oh, very much so. Certainly, when my mom and I came to Canada, it was 1967. I was 8, turning 9, just about to turn 9. And I can remember saying to her in England, we lived in this tiny little English village, tiny. It's called Triplo, it's outside Cambridge. And I can remember saying to her, Mummy, why are we going to America? And, Canada's given me everything. I'm the luckiest guy.
Yeah.
I've had a wonderful career. I've been able to make a difference in all sorts of fields I care deeply about, particularly environment and poverty and inclusion, the connection of both of those. But at that moment, as a little boy, I felt deeply dislocated, and it was actually very difficult to get used to being Canadian. I was handicapped. My mom had made me talk proper English. And I remember coming home from school, and my friends were, sons of farmers. They weren't very many children, but they were sons of farmers or laborers, and they had a very particular accent. And she would correct me and make me sound like the Queen.
Right, right.
And she'd say, if you sound like a farmer, that's all you'll ever be.
Yeah.
Which was true in England at that time. And so I came to Canada with this, snotty English accent. And I also knew all the work, because English primary school was ahead of Canadian. So I very enthusiastically stuck my hand up, and I always had the answer for the questions in this snotty accent.
Right.
That was rather unwelcome.
Right.
The other boys thought I was, I don't know what they thought, but they didn't like me particularly. So I found it very hard to get adjusted. I was an athlete. My sports didn't exist here. There was no cricket and no soccer.
Right.
It was just really, really brutally cold. And people put knives on their feet, and it was very strange, and I found it really difficult to fit in at the beginning, and very, very hard.
Yeah, and I feel like, in a way, and correct me if you think if this is wrong, or let me know if this resonates with you, but I feel like in some ways you've had a bit of a persona as an outsider, a little bit. Like it always felt like you were someone who spoke for anyone who didn't necessarily feel like they fully fit in, if that makes sense. Like even when you first ran, right, you were a real underdog in the beginning, and then you surpassed everyone and you won. And for mayor, I mean. Does that resonate with you, or does that feel like not the case?
I understand what it's like to be an outsider.
Yeah.
I've been very lucky. My mom believed in education, and I got a scholarship and went to a very privileged private school. But I was the scholarship kid.
Right.
And even though things went very well for me at that school, and I've got good friends till this day from the school, I was the scholarship kid.
Yeah.
And you never lose that feeling.
Yeah.
So people could look at me, and I'm blonde. Well, I guess I'm not blonde anymore, but once upon a time,
Right.
blonde-haired, blue-eyed. Literally, I'm a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Right.
I'm an Anglican from England, and
Right.
my mum was the teacher in our village, and the school was run by the Church of England, not by the council, by the church.
Right.
So she technically reported to the minister. Also, not quite how it worked, but so sometimes people look at me and see a version of the people that used to have a lot of power in Toronto, and in some ways still do, but really, I'm somebody coming from a position of being an outsider. And I always have been. This country's been wonderfully welcoming.
Yeah.
But it's different when you come from abroad. And it's a shared experience, I think, regardless of your cultural background. It's a shared experience of people who come to Canada from abroad.
So you grew up Anglican.
Yes.
And are you still Anglican?
Yes.
And was there ever a point in your life where you stepped away from that and came back, or have you been pretty consistent in terms of your beliefs and practices?
Well, I'm a member of our local church.
Yeah.
I go up and down in terms of my attendance at church.
Okay.
And I think my beliefs are more about the teachings of the church that I was taught as a boy about, social inclusion and, not crossing to the other side of the street, and everybody's equal in God's eyes. Those kinds of teachings. That's what I was taught as a boy, and I think it's very much influenced my views of politics, very much so. It also influenced my studies to a degree. I remember studying ethics. I think it was ethics, roles and roles in theories. I think the course was called ethics. Anyway, there were some really interesting philosophical discussions, and the philosophy that I liked was the one that said we should set rules in which we don't know what our end-up position is. And I think, so that to me is about social democracy. That's why I'm a politician from the left, because I think we should be setting rules that are fair to people, everybody, on the assumption that we might, in an alternate, if alternate things have happened, we might be one who is in need.
Right.
And I think all too often the rules get set by those in power to benefit themselves. I don't mean political power, I mean power in society. You can look at what's happening in the US right now with their tax cuts for the richest of the rich, for example. And I think a lot of that came out of going to Sunday school when I was a child and singing endless hymns, and I was an altar boy in my high school, and very, very important from a principles and a set of ethics. I think that's my life has been grounded in those kinds of principles and ethics.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you grow up with these values, and you grow up, clearly you were quite involved in the church and at school, but politics tends to be a fairly secular realm, or it's expected that it's a fairly secular realm. I don't think so much in the States, but I feel like here people will have their religious beliefs, but generally I feel like it's frowned upon for that too.
It's seen to be a private matter in Canada.
Right.
I like that. I find a lot of the self-conscious religious posturing of some in the U.S. to be false. It rings false to me.
Right.
I don't buy it.
Right.
And I think if you act on the principles of your religion, that's a very valid and appropriate thing. I don't buy the missionary zeal of some. It doesn't strike a real chord with me based on how I was brought up.
Do you feel so you have your values, but lots of people have lots of values that come from many different backgrounds, many different religions?
I think all religions have the same core value, which is the golden rule.
Right.
Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That's at the core of every single great religion, and that should be at the core of the principles of how we build a society. And so I see no inconsistency with the values I'm talking about, the values I would expect other people to hold, even if they had grown up Hindu or Sikh or something else.
Right. And so the other side of it, I guess, beyond the values of it, values of a religion, are the spiritual beliefs. And I'm wondering if that's something that, how that manifests for you, what that looks like. Is there a God? Do you know?
Well, there's a great Monty Python skit in which I think they wrestle for God or something, and God ends up existing two falls to one.
Right. Right.
So, my religion is more about how you practice your life. I think that's what I took from growing up Anglican.
Right.
My mom didn't particularly like the church. She viewed it as warlike, and which, just to give some perspective here, my mom came of age in 1939. She got her first job in London, England in 1939.
Wow, okay.
In a place called Dagenham,
Yeah.
which was very badly bombed. And most of the boys she would have known in school went with the East Anglia Regiment to Hong Kong, which had fallen by the time they got there, and none of them came back. And her view was the church, from the pulpit, encouraged that and sent all these beautiful boys to their death.
Right.
So she didn't, in England she had to go to the church, right, because she was the teacher and it was the Church of England school. She didn't like the church as an institution.
Right.
And her own spirituality was something, being English, that she kept very close. And, so for me, I have a different take on it. But the church as an institution was important because I saw it as a place of social justice and inculcated those values. The spiritual side of it's is difficult, and the teachings of my church have changed in the time I've been going there. About hell, for example, and what an afterlife might be.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I find hard to, like, I think of myself as sort of agnostic, and that's kind of what led to me wanting to run this podcast, but I feel like it's something that I know there are people who believe with 100% in something, and I find it hard to understand. I find myself being very skeptical about the concept of a God or something else as a higher power, but at the same time, I also don't want to rule it out because I just don't know. And I don't know day to day how much that would impact my life, regardless. I feel like I have the same life no matter what I believe.
Well, I think if you eliminate doubt, it would influence your life.
Right.
People are able to do that. God bless them. I don't see the world that way, but there's something. There's too many miracles not for there to be something.
Right.
Miracles really do happen.
Yeah.
And I think, I haven't been going to church much lately at all, but 3 or 4 years ago the minister talked about this, and it was interesting. Gave an analogy and said, in the same way you can't understand when you're in the womb what life's going to be like. You don't know, right? And you can't, and so you can't conceive. You just can't conceive of what happens when you die. So it's not possible to conceive of it. So, from my perspective, nobody particularly knows, and there's something, whether it's energy or something. When I was a boy, I hate to keep quoting plays and Monty Python, but I was in a play in high school. It was an anti-racism play called "If There Weren't Any Blacks, They'd Have to Invent Them."
Okay.
And there was the key character is a blind man who is afraid of blacks. And then there's another guy who can see, but he walks backwards because he's afraid of the world. So these are the key characters.
Sure.
And one of them, I think it's the blind man, says, God is white. He lives in a beautiful white house surrounded by well-trimmed English lawns. He wears a bowler hat and carries an umbrella. That's sort of how I was brought up. It was the implication of it. I mean, we sang Jerusalem in church, right? And the song Jerusalem is, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the holy Lamb of God in England's pleasant pastures seen. It's trying to say Jesus was from England.
Right. I guess so.
So, okay, that's how I'm brought up.
Right.
That's obviously not real. So, what I find is when I go to church and there's a choir and it's singing, I'm at peace.
Yeah.
That's all I need. Are there, big picture philosophical questions that, in my own life I've perhaps not addressed head on? Yeah, but that's okay. That feeling gives me sustenance and comfort and calm. It's my meditation when I'm in church. I'm in that familiar environment, and we're singing. And I've been very privileged as an elected official. I've been, I think, to everything. Every kind of, I've been in mosques and synagogues and gurdwaras and Hindu temples and Buddhist and everything.
Yeah.
And I think we all find a slightly different way to, in effect, meditate. But because I was brought up this way, that's where I get my peace the easiest.
Right. Were you to be born in Bombay or somewhere else? Who knows, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And
but the messages might be the same. You might be the same sort of person in the world, but with a different spiritual practice.
Yeah, hard to...
Who knows?
Yeah, very difficult to say what we're growing up in somebody else's, in essence, in somebody else's shoes. But I do think at the heart of... I do know, and there's no doubt at the heart of all the great religions is the golden rule or its equivalent.
So I have another question that... I've been thinking about, and so at a very, very small microcosmic level, I was in student government at my university, and even in that tiny world, I felt, like that I was in a fishbowl. I felt, there was some very challenging times, very challenging conversations. I tended to be on the more left progressive side as well, and when that year was over, I was like, "Oh boy, politics! I can't do it." It's too much anxiety. And I guess I'm wondering, what is this sort of because you've done a lot and you've probably had a lot of challenging conversations and you've been under a lot of scrutiny just by nature of your role and everything else. So, what has kept you kind of motivated, and what kept you going? Was it sort of the feeling that you knew that you had an opportunity to do something that mattered? Was it like...
Well, I think, first of all, I had kind of a righteous anger about injustice. Mm-hmm. And that's what motivated me in politics. And I loved it. I mean, I was lucky. My role grew over time, right? So I was able to grow as a person. So that was very helpful. I mean, if I'd run for mayor when I first ran for council, I wouldn't have been nearly the kind of candidate I was after 9 years of being elected.
Right.
Because there's really important skills and facts and knowledge you learn being elected official. One's to listen. Listening is the most important skill I had. It's faded a bit, gets harder over time. But it really matters in politics, and you actually learn if you listen.
Right.
So, I was driven by righteous anger about injustice, and I think that came from when I was a kid. My mom telling me when I'm 4 years old that I can't speak like my friends. Right? Think of the impact that has on somebody when they're that young.
Yeah.
Seeing the facts, at that point in time in England, there was a test called the 11 Plus, which you took at the age of 11. And if you passed it, you got to go to academic high school. If you failed, you went to trade school at 11. 11 years old.
That's crazy.
And you know who failed? The sons and daughters of working people.
Right. I guess I could have.
And who passed? The upper middle class kids.
Right.
And what happened if an upper middle class kid failed? They didn't go to trade school. They went to a private school, or what they call there a public school, but what we call private school. It's outrageously unjust.
Yeah.
And it was a way of keeping the classes in their places. And I saw this with my eyes at 6 or 7 years old.
Did you get it at 6 or 7?
Oh God, yes. It's really clear.
Yeah.
This is the 60s in England. It's a very class society, depending on your accent. I mean, I was told it every day.
Right.
You can't speak
knew
like that.
But you knew
can't
something
speak
was
like
wrong.
your friends.
You knew something was wrong with that.
Yes, I knew it was wrong. So, I spent my time trying to figure out why it was wrong. So, in university, I took economics. I had an interest in politics in high school, but I didn't get involved in student politics or anything like that. I might have taken politics in university, but for various reasons, I took economics. One of them was I found it pretty easy because I'm good at math. So, it was a way of looking at and understanding the world. Why are some people rich and powerful and others not? And I became a lawyer for the same reason. I wanted to address this injustice, and that's what eventually drew me to politics. And, I'd learned through my studies some things about why the world turns out this way and wanted to correct them.
Yeah, and it just feels like you had this incredible... I don't know if the word drive is the right word, but... Because, I don't know if people realize this, but before you were even a city councillor, you had run in elections and a couple of times, and then you went to municipal elections, and you ran there, and then you became a mayor. So you had to, you really knew that this was there's something unwavering about that to me. Like, you knew that there was a path for you here, or that you believed in this enough that you do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, you took it as a challenge, or
well,
a learning
I
opportunity?
For better or worse, I'm very stubborn. I'm very competitive. And
Yeah.
I'm very determined.
Right.
So, I actually ran for my first election was municipal in 1991, and I lost, but I did way better than anybody expected. And I was sort of asked to run in that one, and I'd been involved in a political party, the New Democratic Party. I'd done everything. And they wanted somebody else to run, and I was interested in municipal because part of my legal practice had been involved with some municipal issues that outraged me. But it was somebody else's push at that time, not mine, but I got a taste for it.
Yeah.
So when I ran in 1994, what I did was I was a partner in a Bay Street law firm, and had a very successful practice. I was liked in the firm. You're exceptionally well compensated, as you can imagine. I resigned from the partnership in order to run because I knew this was how I wanted to make a difference.
Right.
So, and boy, that's a powerful feeling. And it was almost like being in touch with the universe, if you know what I mean. It probably sounds a bit ridiculous, but I knew that this was the right thing for me. I knew this is what I was meant to do, was to run for office. I didn't know I'd win, but I did. And so, I worked incredibly hard in that election, and people kept saying to me, what's going to happen if you lose? And I said, I'm not running to lose.
Right.
And because I had resigned my partnership, it freed me up to put everything I had into that election. And I actually defeated Tony Clement, who went on to become a cabinet minister.
Yeah.
It was not an insubstantial campaign. And I the characteristics I had, being stubborn, and so forth, were really important because I worked incredibly hard to win that election.
Yeah. But it also feels like you had, like you described as righteous anger, but you had a real belief there that that this was more than just winning for the sake of winning, or status. I mean, for you, it really feels like you were like, this is a place I can affect positive change.
It certainly wasn't that status. You don't go from being a partner in Bay Street Law Firm
Right.
to being a city councillor for status.
Right, okay.
Or money, for that matter.
Right.
But, no, I thought I could make a difference.
Yeah.
And I didn't I didn't see anybody else running who could make that difference. There was somebody went on to serve in Stephen Harper's government, and at the time in that campaign, he was calling for bylaws that said you shouldn't have more than 2 or 3 people allowed to talk on a street.
Right.
It was a way of dealing with some street-level crime issues in Parkdale. So you can imagine my reaction to that. I mean, it's outrageous.
Yeah.
But and of course, it would only be applied against some people. It wouldn't be applied against 6 business people standing on a street.
Right. Six people with the right accent.
Right. Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
So it was never for me about personal power. I had to get elected in order to influence things to be what I thought was more fair and more just and more equitable. That was really the goal. And that's what I was driven by, and I think that does go back to some of my roots, both in England and in high school.
And then you also, at a later point, had the support of Jane Jacobs, who I think is a Toronto legend. I mean, we all love Jane Jacobs and the walks, and like she's done a huge amount for cities, like the beautification of cities and appreciation of cities. And I'm wondering if was that a philosophy, sort of, did your philosophy align very much with hers, or was it in meeting her that you sort of expanded how you thought about a city and how you thought about...
Well, it's interesting. Certain parts of what I believe in aligned very much with certain parts of what Jane believed in, about citizens having a real say over the decisions that affect their lives, for example, and about the way a city grows neighborhood by neighborhood, and that neighborhoods are organic. And I believed in her eyes on the street philosophy. I know that's right. I mean, there's just no question it's right. So those kinds of things. She's actually economically quite libertarian. It's a different... she would have a different kind of perspective to... If you read her Economics of Cities... if you read her Economics of Cities, so we might disagree there, but we found places we really agreed. She actually sort of interviewed me for the position of mayor.
Really?
Yeah. I was invited to meet her, and, boy, was she asked the hardest questions. Holy I talked about trying to get a share of the gas tax to finance transit, and she said, that's ridiculous. It's a declining, or this wouldn't be her precise language, but the general sentiment was, that's ridiculous. It's a declining source of revenue. Why aren't you being realistic? And,
right.
But she did come out in support of me, so I must have passed the interview.
Yeah, I guess so. So I'll wrap it up. I really appreciate your time, by the way.
No, it's a pleasure.
And so I guess I'm kind of wondering what the future looks like. Like, your focus right now is with C20. So is there kind of a goal in mind? Because climate change is a huge problem.
So I have 2 responsibilities at our group. The first is I'm the North American Regional Director, so it's my job to support our member mayors in North America in succeeding both in mitigating climate change. We have a C40 program, deadline 2020. The basic idea behind it is everybody needs to start mitigating by 2020, or we're not going to reach the targets we need to. And the big cities are taking a huge lead in that, or whether it's adapting to climate change or resilience. So I support the mayor. I was in New York last week, for example, for their announcement that they're suing all the big oil companies. So it's my role to support those mayors. Then secondly, I have a role internationally on something called inclusive climate action. And what that means is climate change is impacting disproportionately badly the poorest of the poor globally and the poorest in the developed world in cities. So you see in New York, people recovering from Hurricane Sandy in low-income neighborhoods, they're still recovering. And Hurricane Sandy is a climate change related event.
Right.
So it's a new program for us, linking anti-poverty strategies with climate change. But as you can tell from our conversation, that it brings my passions
Of
together.
course, yeah.
And I'm our global ambassador for that. So my role is to help build this international program where we can address social justice and social inclusion. And I couldn't think of something more meaningful at this moment in my life. And I love politics. You know, I actually thought when I was running in for mayor that I'd come back in once my kids had graduated from high school and maybe run federally.
Yeah.
But it turns out I've lost a bit of my righteous anger.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm the kind of politician that has to have that.
Yeah.
I have to be running to make a difference, not running for me to be the difference, to make a difference. So in this way, I can help make a difference, and I'm thrilled.
Yeah, that's so cool. Okay, well, thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening. You can find our website at faithdeficit.com. Faith Deficit's recorded and produced in Guelph, Ontario at Domo Studios. Music by Jeremy Volz. You can hear more of his music at jeremyvolz.com. If you've been enlightened by this week's episode of Faith Deficit, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and provide an iTunes review. You can also support the program on Patreon, and if you do, thanks so much. I'm Josh Bowman, and this is Faith Deficit.